Nobody expected Corporal Keisha Williams to walk into that command tent with evidence that would destroy careers and send people to prison. What she uncovered at Camp Pendleton would shock the entire Marine Corps forever. The California sun beat down mercilessly on Camp Pendleton as Keisha adjusted her combat gear one more time. 3 months with Alpha Company, and she was still the only black woman in a unit of 43 Marines. The stares, the whispered comments, the way conversations died when she entered the tent, it had become her daily reality. Just another day in paradise, she muttered. But this time something was different. Today would be the day everything changed. The morning formation was routine until Gunnery Sergeant Mitchell made an announcement that made Keisha's blood boil. The promotion list had been posted, and once again her name wasn't on it despite scoring highest on every evaluation for 6 consecutive months. She watched as Corporal Johnson, a white Marine who had joined 2 months after her, received his promotion to sergeant. His smirk as he looked in her direction told her everything she needed to know about how he felt about the situation. But what Keisha had discovered the night before would wipe that smirk off his face permanently. While working late in the communications tent, Keisha had stumbled across something that made her stomach turn. Hidden in a folder marked administrative records were photographs, text messages, and documented incidents that painted a picture of systematic harassment and cover-up that went all the way to the top. The evidence showed a network of Marines who had been targeting not just her but every minority who had cycled through Alpha Company over the past 2 years. But this wasn't just about racial harassment. What she found was far worse than she had imagined. The photographs showed female Marines in compromising positions, taken without their consent during training exercises and barracks inspections. The text messages revealed a point system where Marines earned scores for humiliating minorities and women. The documented incidents showed how complaints had been buried, transferred Marines who spoke up, and destroyed evidence of misconduct. At the center of it all was Gunnery Sergeant Mitchell, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, and Sergeant First Class Thompson, 3 career Marines who had turned Alpha Company into their personal hunting ground for harassment and abuse. But they had made one critical mistake. They had underestimated Keisha Williams. Growing up in Detroit, Keisha had learned early that bullies only understood one language: consequences. Her mother had taught her to document everything, trust no one completely, and always have an exit strategy. Those lessons were about to pay off in ways the harassers never imagined. Instead of going through official channels where she knew the complaints would disappear, Keisha began building an airtight case that would be impossible to ignore or cover up. She started by secretly recording conversations, photographing evidence with her personal phone, and creating backup copies of everything she found. But her real stroke of genius was what she did next. She reached out to the families of previous victims who had been quietly transferred or discharged to avoid scandal. What she learned from them would provide the final pieces of a puzzle that would destroy the entire network. Over the next month, Keisha pretended to be the same intimidated Marine they expected while systematically gathering evidence that would end careers and send people to prison. She endured the harassment, smiled through the humiliation, and played the role of the defeated victim while building a case that would make prosecutors salivate. The breaking point came when Staff Sergeant Rodriguez cornered her in the supply tent and made it clear that her refusal to play along with their system would result in consequences that would follow her for the rest of her military career. What Rodriguez didn't know was that every word was being recorded. "You think you're special because you're smart, Williams? Let me tell you how this works. You can do things the easy way, or you can do them the hard way. But either way, you're going to learn your place in this unit." Rodriguez's hands were on her shoulders when he made the threat, and the recording captured not just his words but the sound of her equipment being moved aside. It was sexual harassment, assault, and conduct unbecoming captured in digital clarity that no military court could ignore. But Keisha's response surprised him completely. Instead of backing down or trying to escape, she looked him straight in the eye and smiled. "Sergeant Rodriguez, I want you to remember this moment. Remember exactly what you just said and did, because in about 2 weeks, you're going to wish you had made different choices." The confusion on his face was priceless, but he had no idea that he had just provided the final piece of evidence needed to complete a case that would destroy everything he had built. That evening, Keisha made the calls that would change everything. But she didn't call the military police. the Inspector General, or even her commanding officer. Instead, she called the FBI. What the harassment network didn't know was that their activities had crossed from military misconduct into federal crimes. The photographs constituted production and distribution of pornographic material without consent. The point system created a conspiracy to violate civil rights. The cover-ups involved obstruction of justice and abuse of authority under federal law. Special Agent Sarah Chen of the FBI's Civil Rights Division was very interested in Keisha's evidence, especially when she learned that similar patterns had been reported at 3 other military installations. What had started as harassment at one Marine base was actually part of a much larger investigation into systematic civil rights violations across multiple military commands. The FBI had been looking for a way into this network for over a year, and Keisha had just handed them everything they needed on a silver platter. But the real beauty of Keisha's plan was what happened next. Instead of immediately arresting the perpetrators, Agent Chen and Keisha worked together to set up a sting operation that would capture the entire network in action. Keisha would continue playing the role of victim while wearing recording equipment that would document every threat, every act of harassment, and every attempt to cover up misconduct. Over the next 2 weeks, the network obligingly provided hours of recorded evidence of their crimes, while thinking they were breaking down their last holdout victim. Gunnery Sergeant Mitchell personally threatened Keisha with false disciplinary charges. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez made increasingly aggressive sexual advances. Sergeant Thompson tried to intimidate her with tales of what happened to Marines who didn't know their place. Every word was recorded, every threat was documented. Every crime was captured with the kind of clarity that would make defense attorneys weep. The day of reckoning came during what the perpetrators thought was a routine training exercise. As Alpha Company assembled for morning formation, unmarked vehicles surrounded the area. FBI agents in tactical gear moved with military precision as they simultaneously arrested 7 Marines and 2 officers on federal charges ranging from civil rights violations to production and distribution of illegal pornographic material. The looks of shock and confusion on the faces of the harassment network as they were handcuffed and read their rights was everything Keisha had hoped for. But the sweetest moment came when Gunnery Sergeant Mitchell looked directly at her and realized who had orchestrated his downfall. "You did this," he said, his voice filled with disbelief and rage. Keisha smiled and replied, "I told you to remember that moment 2 weeks ago. I hope you do remember it, because you're going to have plenty of time to think about it where you're going." The arrests were just the beginning of consequences that would ripple through the entire Marine Corps. The FBI investigation uncovered evidence of similar harassment networks at Camp Lejeune, Quantico, and Marine Corps Base Hawaii. The case became the largest civil rights prosecution in military history, with over 30 personnel facing federal charges and dozens more receiving military discipline. But for Keisha, the real victory wasn't the prosecutions, it was what happened to the culture at Camp Pendleton. The new leadership implemented zero-tolerance policies for harassment and discrimination. Training programs were overhauled to emphasize respect and professionalism. Most importantly, reporting systems were reformed to prevent the kind of cover-ups that had protected the harassment network. 6 months after the arrest, Keisha received the promotion to sergeant that she had earned months earlier. But more satisfying than the promotion was the letter she received from a young Hispanic woman who had just arrived at Camp Pendleton as a new Marine. "Corporal Williams, I wanted to thank you for what you did. Because of your courage, I'm serving in a unit where I'm judged by my performance, not my gender or ethnicity. You didn't just get justice for yourself, you got justice for all of us who come after you." But the most satisfying moment of all came during the sentencing hearing. Keisha chose to give a victim impact statement at the sentencing of Gunnery Sergeant Mitchell, the ringleader of the harassment network. Standing at the podium in her dress blue uniform, she looked directly at the man who had tried to destroy her career and break her spirit. "Your Honor, Gunnery Sergeant Mitchell spent months trying to teach me what he called my places in the Marine Corps. He was right that I needed to learn my place. My place is standing up for what's right. My place is protecting other Marines from predators who abuse their authority. My place is proving that the Marine Corps is better than people like him." She paused, looking Mitchell directly in the eye before continuing. "He tried to break me down, but instead he built me up into someone strong enough to take him down. So in a way, I should thank him for teaching me exactly what kind of Marine I never want to be, and exactly what kind of Marine I'm proud to be." Mitchell was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, and dishonorably discharged from the Marines. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez received 6 years, and was also dishonorably discharged. The other members of the network received sentences ranging from 2 to 5 years, with all losing their military careers and benefit. But perhaps the most fitting consequence was what happened to their reputations. The case received national media attention as an example of how systematic harassment could be defeated by one person's courage and intelligence. Keisha became a symbol of positive change in military culture, while the perpetrators became cautionary tales about the consequences of abusing authority. The Marines who had participated in the harassment found themselves unemployable in law enforcement, security, or any field that required background check. Their military service, which should have been a source of pride, became a liability that followed them for the rest of their lives. Meanwhile, Keisha's career flourished. She was selected for advanced leadership training, received commendations for her role in the investigation, and became a sought-after speaker on military culture reform. The woman they had tried to drive out of the Corps became one of its most respected voices for change. 5 years later, Keisha stood in the same command tent where her ordeal had begun, but now she wore the chevrons of a staff sergeant and served as Alpha Company's senior non-commissioned officer. The unit she now led was diverse, professional, and focused on excellence rather than harassment. During a leadership meeting with new arrivals, she shared the lesson she had learned from her experience. "Marines, you're going to face challenges in your career that test who you really are. Some people will try to break you down, exclude you, or make you feel like you don't belong. When that happens, you have a choice. You can let them win by giving up, or you can fight back by being better than they are." She looked around the room at faces representing every background and ethnicity the Marine Corps recruited from. "I chose to fight back, and it changed not just my life, but the lives of every Marine who serves after me. That's the power you have when you refuse to accept injustice and choose to do something about it." After the meeting, a young black male Marine approached her with a question that brought everything full circle. "Staff Sergeant Williams, what you did took incredible courage. How did you find the strength to take on the entire system?" Keisha smiled, remembering her mother's words from years ago. "Marine, I didn't take on the system. I used the system the way it's supposed to work. The Marine Corps has values, honor, courage, and commitment. When people violate those values, the system is designed to hold them accountable. I just made sure the system had all the information it needed to work properly." "But weren't you afraid of retaliation?" "Of course I was afraid. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing the right thing despite fear. And sometimes doing the right thing means accepting risk to protect other people." She looked out at the California landscape where she had endured months of harassment and humiliation before turning the tables on her tormentors. "The most important thing I learned is that bullies and predators count on good people staying silent. They count on victims being too afraid or too isolated to fight back. When someone finally stands up to them, they usually discover that bullies are much weaker than they pretend to be." The young Marine nodded, clearly inspired by her word. "Thank you, Staff Sergeant. I hope I have your courage if I ever face a situation like that." "You will," Keisha replied confidently, "because now you know it's possible to win. That knowledge changes everything." As the young Marine walked away, Keisha reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The harassment network that had tried to destroy her career was now serving federal prison sentences. The culture that had protected them had been transformed into one that valued respect and professionalism. The woman they had tried to break had become a leader who inspired others to stand up for what's right. Standing in that command tent 5 years later, wearing the rank they had tried to prevent her from earning, leading the unit they had tried to drive her from, Keisha Williams smiled at the perfect justice of it all. The Marines who had tried to teach her her place had learned their own place, behind bars, dishonored and forgotten by the institution they had disgraced. Meanwhile, the woman they had underestimated had claimed her rightful place as a leader who would ensure that no future Marine would have to endure what she had experienced. That evening, as she completed her final paperwork before heading home, Keisha received an email that reminded her why her fight had been worth every risk she had taken. It was from Special Agent Chen, who had become a close friend over the years since the investigation. Keisha, I wanted you to know that your case has become the model for how we handle military harassment investigation. The techniques you developed for gathering evidence and building prosecutable cases are now taught at the FBI Academy. You didn't just get justice for yourself, you created a blueprint for justice that will help victims for decades to come. Keisha saved the email and added it to a folder she kept of messages from Marines whose lives had been changed by her willingness to fight back. The folder contained hundreds of messages from women and minorities who now served in a Marine Corps that judged them by their abilities rather than their demographic. But the most meaningful message came from an unexpected source 3 months later. A letter arrived from federal prison, bearing the name of former Gunnery Sergeant Mitchell. Keisha stared at the envelope for several minutes before deciding to open it. Staff Sergeant Williams, I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, but I needed to write this letter. I've had 2 years in federal prison to think about what I did to you and the other Marines under my command. I can't undo the pain I caused, or take back the harassment and humiliation I put you through. The letter continued for 3 pages, detailing Mitchell's journey from denial to acceptance, to genuine remorse. He wrote about the therapy sessions that had helped him understand how his own insecurities and prejudices had driven him to abuse his authority. He described the shame of explaining to his children why their father was in prison, and how his actions had brought dishonor to the Marine Corps uniform he had once worn with pride. I know you have no reason to forgive me, and I'm not asking for forgiveness. What I'm asking is that you know that your courage to stand up to me and expose what we were doing saved other Marines from experiencing what you went through. You did what a real Marine is supposed to do. You protected your fellow Marines from an enemy, even when that enemy was wearing the same uniform you were. The letter ended with a request that surprised Keisha completely. Mitchell asked if she would consider visiting him in prison, not for his benefit, but so he could look her in the eye and apologize properly for what he had put her through. He wanted to tell her in person that she had been everything a Marine should be, while he had been everything a Marine should never become. Keisha set the letter aside and thought about it for weeks. Part of her wanted to ignore it completely. Mitchell had forfeited any right to her consideration when he had made her life hell for months, but another part of her remembered the lessons her mother had taught her about mercy and the possibility of redemption, even for people who seemed irredeemable. After consulting with Agent Chen and her own therapist, Keisha decided to make the visit, not because Mitchell deserved it, but because she wanted to close that chapter of her life completely and see for herself what justice looked like when it was truly served. The federal prison was a stark, imposing building that seemed designed to crush the spirits of those confined within its walls. As Keisha went through the security procedures, she reflected on how different her life might have been if she hadn't found the courage to fight back against the harassment network. When Mitchell was brought into the visiting room, Keisha barely recognized the arrogant, intimidating figure who had tried to break her spirit had been replaced by a broken man who looked years older than his actual age. His Marine haircut had grown out into an unkempt mess, and his prison uniform hung loosely on a frame that had lost considerable weight. Staff Sergeant Williams, thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would. His voice was different too. Gone was the commanding tone that had once made Marines jump to attention. In its place was the humble, almost pleading voice of a man who had lost everything and knew it was his own fault. I came because I wanted to see what consequences look like. Gunnery Sergeant Mitchell. I wanted to see what happens when someone chooses to abuse their authority, instead of using it to build people up. Mitchell nodded, accepting the harsh truth of her words without defensiveness. You're looking at what happens when someone forgets what it means to be a Marine. When someone lets their own fears and prejudices turn them into exactly the kind of person the Marine Corps exists to stand against. They talked for an hour, with Mitchell taking full responsibility for his actions action, and expressing genuine remorse for the pain he had caused. He told Keisha about the letters he had written to every Marine who had been harassed by his network, accepting responsibility and apologizing without making excuses. Most importantly, he told her about the educational program he had developed for the prison, teaching other inmates about the consequences of harassment and discrimination. It was his way of trying to ensure that others didn't make the same mistakes he had made, even if he could never undo the damage he had caused. Staff Sergeant William, I want you to know that you won completely, not just in getting justice, but in proving that the Marine Corps values you stood for were stronger than the hatred and prejudice we represented. You were the real Marine in that situation, and history will remember you that way. As Keisha prepared to leave, Mitchell made one final request. Would you do me one favor? When you're training young Marine, tell them my story. Not to make them feel sorry for me, but to show them what happens when Marines forget their values and start seeing their fellow Marines as enemies instead of brothers and sisters. Help them understand that being a Marine means protecting everyone under your command, regardless of their race, gender, or background. Keisha considered his request carefully before responding. I'll tell your story, Gunnery Sergeant Mitchell, but I'll tell it my way, as a cautionary tale about what happens when people abuse their authority and forget that their job is to build up their Marine, not tear them down. And I'll tell it alongside the stories of Marines who chose differently, who used their authority to create positive change instead of perpetuating harm. As she walked out of that prison, Keisha felt a sense of closure she hadn't expected. Seeing Mitchell broken and remorseful didn't give her satisfaction the way she thought it would. Instead, it reinforced her belief that the real victory had been in transforming the Marine Corps culture to prevent other Marines from becoming either victims or perpetrators of harassment. The drive back to Camp Pendleton gave her time to reflect on how much had changed since that morning when she had first stood up to challenge the promotion decision. The frightened, isolated Marine who had discovered the harassment evidence had grown into a confident leader who was reshaping military culture for future generations. 6 months later, Keisha received notification that she had been selected for promotion to Gunnery Sergeant 1, the same rank Mitchell had held when he was terrorizing Marines under his command. But unlike Mitchell, Keisha would use that authority to build up her Marine and create an environment where everyone could succeed based on their merit. The promotion ceremony took place in the same area where she had endured months of harassment and humiliation. As the new chevrons were pinned to her uniform, Keisha looked out at the assembled Marine and saw faces representing every background the Marine Corps recruited from, all standing together as one unit focused on excellence and mutual respect. During her promotion speech, Keisha chose to share the lesson that had guided her journey from victim to leader. Marines' leadership isn't about having power over people. It's about empowering people to be their best self. It's about creating an environment where every Marine can succeed regardless of their background, and it's about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult or dangerous. She paused, looking directly at the young Marine, who reminded her of herself when she had first arrived at Camp Pendleton. Some of you will face challenges that test your character and your commitment to Marine values. When that happens, remember that you have more power than you think. You have the power to document injustice, to build cases for change, and to transform systems that aren't working properly. Most importantly, you have the power to choose whether you'll be part of the problem or part of the solution. After the ceremony, a young Hispanic Marine approached Keisha with a question that brought her full circle. Gunnery Sergeant Williams, what advice would you give to someone who's experiencing harassment or discrimination? Keisha smiled, remembering asking similar questions when she was starting her own journey toward justice. Marine, document everything. Build your case carefully and thoroughly. Find allies who share your value. Use the system the way it's designed to work. And never forget that fighting for justice isn't just about getting revenge, it's about preventing other people from having to go through what you experience. But what if I'm afraid of retaliation? Fear is natural.
but don't let it paralyze. Remember that bullies and harassers count on good people staying silent. When someone finally stands up to them, they usually discover that the bullies were weaker than they appeared. And remember that you're not just fighting for yourself, you're fighting for every Marine who comes after you. That evening, as Gunnery Sergeant Keisha Williams completed her first day in her new rank, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The harassment network that had tried to destroy her was serving federal prison sentence. The culture that had protected them had been transformed into one that valued respect and professionalism. The Marine they had tried to break had become a leader who would ensure that future generations of Marines served in an environment that honored the Corps' highest values. Standing in the command tent where her ordeal had begun, now wearing the rank of the man who had once tried to humiliate, Keisha Williams allowed herself a moment of deep satisfaction. She had gotten her revenge, but it was revenge that had made the Marine Corps stronger, safer, and more just for everyone who would serve after her. The scared, isolated Marine who had discovered evidence of systematic harassment had grown into a confident leader whose courage had transformed an entire military culture. That transformation would be her lasting legacy, not just the punishment of those who had wronged her, but the protection of countless Marines would never have to experience the harassment and discrimination she had endured. As she prepared to leave the command tent that had once been a place of torment but was now her seat of leadership, Keisha smiled at the perfect justice of it all. She had learned her place in the Marine Corps, exactly as Mitchell had promised she would. At the top, leading with honor, courage, and commitment while ensuring that every Marine under her command knew they belonged and would be judged solely by their character and performance. That was a lesson worth teaching and a revenge worth taking.